Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. It's going to be a solo show this week, and we're going to talk about trauma awareness. Now, trauma has been getting a lot of press very recently. For those who've been following the Prince Harry story, he was interviewed by Gabor Mate, who's a personal hero of mine and also a trauma expert for his book Spare. So that's trauma's been in the news. And I'm just seeing it pop up a lot more in the business context, this idea of trauma awareness and the importance of that. Okay, so let's start with the definition. What do we mean by trauma? Well, very simply, it's a shock or an injury. It's a painful event that leaves a wound. And as Daniela Seiff puts out, who's been on the podcast, whether or not we experience an event as a wounding event or shocking or an injurious event is determined by who you are at that time and the event itself. So it's this intersection of the organism of you at that moment of the event and the event itself. And together, they determine whether or not you experience a trauma. So the two different people could experience the same event. One might experience as a trauma and the other not. And then the other point she makes is it determines our future from that moment forward, from the moment of the trauma. As she puts it, when we suffer overwhelmingly painful or frightening experiences, a damaging imprint is left on our minds and bodies, sending our lives onto a different path. On this path, we live our lives from inside an altered biological and physiological reality. So she's making a really important point in the first sentence there, that it's something that's overwhelming. It's something where we don't have any agency in the matter. That is a hallmark of a traumatic event. And she's also making that point that it changes us forevermore unless we intervene, unless we do the healing, which is obviously a big theme on being human. So that's the definition of a trauma. And so how does it play out in our lives? Well, the person who I think has done the best thinking on this in terms of simplifying it and making it easy to understand is Dr. Ingeborg Bosch. She's also been a guest on the show, and she has this model, which I love, of adult consciousness and child consciousness. So she posits that we live our lives in one of two modes. Either we're in adult consciousness or we're in child consciousness. And when we get triggered, so when there's an event that resonates, that's very similar in some way to a past traumatic event, we're thrown into child consciousness. And that's when we react in childish ways. But when we're sailing through life and we're not being triggered by anything, we're in adult consciousness, we're behaving in appropriate ways to the situation, we're dealing rationally with life. And depending on how traumatized we are, we'll spend more or less of our time in either adult consciousness or child consciousness. Now, what's this band in the middle called defenses? Well, this is the protective mechanism that our bodies employ to have us not feel the full pain of that early trauma, which stays in the body. It doesn't go anywhere. Once we're traumatized, that imprint persists in the body forevermore. And so it's our defenses that help us not to feel the full pain of that early trauma. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that trauma and the trigger process works. So we have a trigger outside somewhere in our life. Maybe the boss speaks to us the wrong way. Maybe our partner criticizes us in some way that has us triggered. So we have this trigger event that our adult consciousness is experiencing, but that creates a resonance with something that happened in our past, and it throws us into child consciousness. But we get a mediated experience of this child consciousness, so we get a lessened, a dampened down version of this because our defenses kick in. And so what our defenses do, it's a mode of behavior. It's a way of being that is helping us to not fully feel the pain of that early trauma, because of the way that we experience life. Is if something is similar enough to an old pain, there's some part of us that wants to heal. There's some part of us that wants to dive into that pain and feel and experience that old wound as a means of healing. But there's this other part of us that doesn't want us to go there, that wants to protect us from that. And so it employs the defenses. And Ingeborg Bosch enumerates these defenses. She says there are 5 of them. The first is the primary defense. Second is denial of needs. The third is false power. The fourth is false hope. And the fifth is fear as a response. And we'll talk more about that. So there are these 5 defenses that we can go, these defensive patterns, if you like, that we go in. Now, it's still potentially uncomfortable to be in one of these defensive patterns. It is a form of suffering to be acting out of a defense, but it's still less painful than fully feeling that old buried pain. And that's why this exists, and that's why we're subconsciously using them. And I'll get to how this helps us understand workplace behaviors, but also just behaviors in general in your life. So let's talk about them. So primary defense. This is when we enter into a story, I'm not good enough. I can't do this. I'm useless, right? You might hear that a lot when somebody's faced with a challenge. Now, if you start to hear people using this language, I'm not good enough, I'm useless, that sounds like a child, right? So that's a tell of somebody who's been triggered and they're defending against an old trauma. And that's the primary defense. Now, being in that story is uncomfortable for someone, but it's a lot less painful than fully feeling that old trauma where maybe they were, abandoned by a caregiver at a certain moment, or something happened very painful in their past. So that's primary defense. The second defense is false power. This is where you have an angry reaction. So we've all been in that situation. Something seems trivial, something seems minor, and you get this rage machine in front of you. You're an asshole. You're no good. I'm better than you. You're just shit on my shoe. Whatever it might be. That stance of I'm great and you're not is somebody who's been triggered into false power. So it's a way of them not feeling pain in their past. It's a story that they can then generate themselves about themselves, which is a salve on that early pain. Yeah, it's a balm. It takes the edge off what that early pain might have been. So if you hear someone raging and telling you how great they are and how shit you are, or shit somebody else is, that's somebody in false power. False hope, very common one. So this is where somebody's, I know this is awful, but one day it will be better. One day we'll get out of this. You might find that in change situations in a company where perhaps the business is experiencing some kind of stress or is going through some change which people at some level find uncomfortable. For those who've been triggered into a trauma response, what you might hear them saying is, well, what one day when this boss is gone, or when this project is over, or when this competitor leaves the market, whatever it might be, then it will be okay. And that's somebody in false hope. They're not allowing themselves to experience the present reality, which might open them up to feeling old pain. They've allowed themselves to trip into a narrative about the future, basically. Now, the third one is denial of needs. So this is the iron jacket, right? This is none of this matters. I'm fine. It's okay. And they're just not allowing themselves to feel anything about the current situation. It's all that sort of stoic stance. Now, a lot to be said about stoicism, not knocking stoicism, but when people are allowing themselves to go into that stance on a compulsive basis, they're not choosing. It's just they get triggered into it. Oh, it's fine. It's all okay. There's no problem here. That's a very common defense. Again, in the context of change and transformation, super common to have people go into that form of defense. Again, they might something about the change or the proposal or whatever it is has triggered them into some old pain, into child consciousness, but the defense kicks in and has them not feel it fully, and they're just telling themselves it's all okay. Fifth and final one is fear. So this is a fear-based narrative. So they genuinely are feeling fear, but they're not allowing themselves to fully sink into that old pain and really feel the terror and the fear that may be associated with that event from early in their life. And they're kind of putting a veneer on it, and they're saying, "Oh, I'm scared about what might happen. What if this happens? What if that happens?" They're in the kind of washing machine thoughts about all the potential worst case scenarios that they're telling you they're fearful about. So again, that's another tell that somebody's been triggered. And instead of saying, I feel terrified, and this, this is resident of some past trauma, and really allowing themselves to feel that, they're just talking about the present reality and how fearful they are about everything that might be coming down the track. So that's the fifth defense, the fear defense. And once you start to understand these defenses, you'll spot it much more commonly how people are triggered into these patterns, and that's something that can be very useful. As I said, and you can start to understand your own patterns and your own defenses and where you get triggered into these, and you can almost use it as a litmus test to how far you are with your own healing. Another tell outside of defense is just the language that people use. If people are using childlike language, that's another great tell that they've been triggered. If somebody's saying, "I feel suffocated," for example, that could very well be them not using that as a metaphor, but actually that's a tell from their subconscious that they've been triggered into very early pain. Suffocation is often something that we experience as neonates, as we're coming through birth. So that can be a tell that somebody's been triggered. And this might sound a bit far-fetched for some of you listening, but that can be a tell that somebody's been triggered into birth trauma if you feel that, if you hear them saying that they're suffocated or "I can't breathe," anything of that nature. Another one might be, I'm overwhelmed, I can't do this, right? Which is legitimate for a kid. There are very often situations where kids genuinely do feel overwhelmed or feel like they can't do it. But if somebody's using that type of language as an adult, very often that means they've been triggered. If you hear language like, "They're going to kill me, my boss is going to kill me," they're not going to kill you, right? They're not going to kill you. Unless you're in, some extreme wartime situation. For most of the circumstances that most of us experiences, nobody's ever at risk of being killed by a boss. But the child, if they've been triggered unknowingly been triggered into a traumatic experience from earlier in their life, then there would have been certain situations as a child which would have genuinely felt life-threatening. If you've got a raging caregiver who's about to beat you or to thrash you, might genuinely feel like your life was at threat in that moment, in that early traumatic moment. And so what you're really hearing there is a tell in the language from someone's earlier experiences. Okay, I know I've offered a lot there, but just to boil it down for you. So the first thing we talked about is, what is a trauma? It's a shock. It's an injury from earlier in our life, a wound, an emotional wound from earlier in our life that has changed our physiological, our biological cells forevermore, and it stays with us. That trauma stays with us unless we intervene to heal it. And when we experience an event similar in some way, we call that a trigger. So when a boss criticizes our report, that may resonate with a traumatic experience in our child when we were heavily criticized by a parent, which left us feeling very fearful of abandonment or some other significantly negative outcome. And we felt like we had no agency. We felt overwhelmed by that situation. So the present moment reality, the boss criticizing our report, resonates with something deep in our past when we were traumatized. And that mechanism plays out continually in our lives, unknowingly. And we have defenses to protect us from feeling that early pain that create a narrative in our head. So we move forward into the front of the brain. We're avoiding those powerful feelings that emerge from deep in the base of our brain. We move to the front of our brain. We create a story about the event, and we enter in one of these defensive patterns. and we talked about the 5 defensive patterns. Primary defense, I'm not good enough. False power, I'm great and you're not. False hope, one day it'll be better. Denial of needs, it's all fine. And fear, I'm worried about the future. And we also talked about the fact that another tell, as well as spotting when somebody's in one of those 5 defensive patterns, is when people are using language which sounds like it would be more appropriately expressed by a child in a traumatic situation and not as an adult. Like, they're going to kill me. I feel suffocated. I can't do this. There's no hope. When somebody's using that type of language, it's also a tell that they've been traumatized. So in the past, and they've been triggered into it. I hope that makes sense. That was a fairly brief rundown of the way I approach trauma awareness. Let me know what you think in the comments, or reach out to me. I'd love to hear how useful you found this. Thanks.